Today's guest, Robert Scheer, was Vietnam correspondent and an editor of Ramparts magazine from 1964 to 1969. Now, 64 is over 45 years ago. I don't say that to make Bob feel old, but to make clear how long he's been reporting, writing, and fighting the good fight. I've been reading or listening to him on the radio for much of that time, and he's been a guest in the show several times before. Now, as we close in on the end of 2010, with the Afghanistan and Iraq wars still raging, the official unemployment rate at nearly 10%, the Dow Jones closed Friday at 11,382 and NASDAQ neared a 3-year high. Gold is above $1,400 an ounce and oil over $89 a barrel. Barack Obama announced a unilateral wage freeze for the federal government, and if the past is any indication, is poised to agree to a unilateral compromise, if you will, extending Bush tax cuts for the wealthy that will put the lie to all the deficit hysteria fueling the Tea Party and the Beltway hunger to cut Social Security. Now, that's a lot of bad news. But one of the things that I appreciate about Bob Scheer is his passion. Though he may rail against the Clinton Democrats, the altered reality that takes place in the Beltway, the timidity of the media, the greed and corruption of so many who profit from the hard times of others, as he does in his newest book, The Great American Stick-Up, he never seems to lose his fire for the truth and the future. And at this point, I wonder, is it hope or just habit? I'm going to ask Scheer to join me in stepping back a bit from the latest headline or the next shoe about to fall and take a longer view. What has happened in and to America over this last half century? What has happened to democracy and the middle class? And what about the rest of the world? What is broken? How did it get broken? And how are we possibly going to fix things? I'm going to put on the table at top one of the big questions that I hear in my ear all the time. If we could look back from about 20 years in the future, say from 2030, did the U.S. and the world turn things around? And if so, how did we do it? Bob Scheer, as I said, was Vietnam correspondent and editor of Ramparts magazine from 1964 to 69. He was with the L.A. Times for nearly 3 decades as a national correspondent, as a columnist. That ended in 95, and he immediately started Truthdig, where he is co-founder and editor-in-chief of Truthdig.com. And I remember, Bob, we had you on when I was on at night, the night before the first morning that Truthdig was going to happen. Yeah.
Well, it's been a great journey. It's been 5 years, and we've had over 50 million unique visitors. I think we've had a good impact. We have some terrific writers like Chris Hedges, who used to be the New York Times bureau chief and have found a home at Truthdig, and Bill Boyarsky, who was the political correspondent and editor for the Los Angeles Times, has found a home there. So we have good stuff. Let me disagree with your setup, basically.
Do.
I'm not some passionate fool banging my head against the wall. I have seen a great deal of progress in my life, and it gives me tremendous energy and optimism. First of all, I don't think one should have a U.S.-centric view of the world to begin with. The whole world is not in trouble. There's parts of the world that actually have handled the dislocation that we caused with our stupid economic policies with this meltdown and seem to be doing a bit better. I think of Germany, I think of China, I think of India. They seem to be weathering this and actually surviving. Brazil, I'm sorry, that was a very important example, Brazil, under a democratic socialist leader. So it's not all disaster out there, and in fact what may be happening is the center of the world is shifting away from us. We had a pretty much a free ride after World War II. I'm old enough to remember those days, and the slogan was free, white, and 21. They should have put male in there, and then you didn't even have to go to high school. You had a good job, and you could get a little house with the veterans $99 down, and that's what a lot of my relatives did.
Absolutely. That's what my family did.
Yeah,
my dad got his education on the GI Bill, and then...
Well, even when I went to school, I'm half German Protestant, half Russian Jew, and the Jews were starting to go to college more often, but the German side, they all thought I was out of my mind. Go become a tool and die maker, become a machinist. What are you doing, going to city college for? So In those terms, I think the big change that we're seeing is not so much that the world has problems it can't solve or is impoverished, but that, the U.S. may not be the main player, but certainly be a lesser player. And I think that's all to the good for humanity if you have a broad enough view of it. However, I am concerned about this country and love it and care about its problems, which I think are very real. Let me also say something about this whole thing of progress and being on the left. I've seen a great deal of change in my time. When I was growing up, one of my best friends was a guy we called Negro in those days, and he was a terrific baseball player, a terrific athlete. Not to perpetuate his stereotype, but he just was the best athlete in my part of the Bronx. And, his little kids and everything, until Jackie Robinson came in, he couldn't play professional baseball, and even then would have had to rise to such heroic proportions. I remember going through the South in 1960 in the segregated South. I was in where Jimmy Carter came from, Plains, and I went to a Koinonia Farm, an integrated Christian communist community or communal community on Christian principles that was being bombed and everything back in 60 in those areas. And if we're not for people at KPFA and The Nation and others sending money, they wouldn't have even survived. So I remember the old South. I remember the reality of kind of neo-segregation in the North. And, here, even in Los Angeles, your major clubs not only didn't allow people of color and women, they didn't allow, Jews, they didn't allow, so, and that's not ancient history. The Jonathan Club, I think was as late as 79 had a case up before the Supreme Court. Challenging
the Jonathan Club on the beach in Santa Monica.
The one downtown, but then on the beach they were trying to expand later, and so I've seen progress in many areas.
And then you've even left out all the gender homosexual. Phenomenal.
No, I'm
progress
going to get to that.
Yeah.
I think now let me tell you, if you want my broad view of things, and that goes to the banking meltdown, which is what my Great American Stick-Up is all about. I do think there's been a lot of progress, and I'm not sympathetic to people who say, woe is me, I'll just go tend to my turnips or something. I think we've seen a lot of progress, even on the question of war and peace. It took us a long time to stop the Vietnam War, but we were able to do it eventually. I think back, I'm on a show on NPR on KCRW. I like it very much, left, right, and center.
Right.
But our center guy, Matt Miller, keeps talking about the center as if somehow some great virtuous center. And I keep thinking, well, wait a minute. When I published Martin Luther King in Ramparts, we had to publish him because the New York Times wouldn't publish him. They denounced his coming out against the Vietnam War. And nobody was celebrating Cesar Chavez, who we have a street named after, as well as King here. We published him in Ramparts and celebrated him very early on, and because he wasn't being celebrated by the center, so-called. Right. And I always think, what was the center? Was it Lyndon Johnson? Was it Richard Nixon? What is the center? The center's caused a great deal of meanness and nastiness and bloodshed in this world, and the center is really not a philosophical outlook. It's not taking a position of principle or morality. The center is positioning yourself. And sometimes if you're in Germany, as Hitler is rising, positioning yourself in the center meant you became a Nazi, okay? And positioning yourself when Richard Nixon was president meant you became a right-wing Republican, or when Ronald Reagan was president. So I like the feistiness of Pacifica, and I hope it can keep going. And I don't trust in general, the whole sort of NPR outlook that somehow we just don't raise our voice or show any passion and all is wonderful. And my book really takes on two targets.
What impressed me, and I've read other of your books, but I thought I've read so many books on the meltdown and interviewed so many folks that I went and saw Inside Job, Charles Ferguson's. It's a very good film, very good film. How much was new in it for me at this point? Not that much. Mainly the academic, the co-optation of all of academia. But your book is full of things I didn't know.
Now, my book, I can say with all due modesty, is the definitive study of how this happened. And the reason I say that is because there's a lot of noise, and I like, by the way, Inside Story. I think it's a very good documentary.
Yeah, so do I.
And actually parallels the line of my book. But, a lot of these Wall Street books, they're all about inside baseball and how is it done in the trading floor. And some of them are good. Nomi Prince, who's been on Pacifica, is very good. But what I got at is because of the way we teach economics and the way we approach Wall Street. I got at the political economy of it. And this this was not part of the natural flow of capitalism. These credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations and all these newfangled financial gimmicks. This didn't come in Adam Smith's capitalism. They didn't come in Ronald Reagan's capitalism, actually. This is a phenomenon, really, of the 90s, unleashed in the 90s. And unleashed, it's a scam. That's why I call it the Great American Stick-Up. What happened was, this is not global warming, and this is not the loss of jobs internationally. This is not the problem of our education. We have a lot of big problems, okay? This is not one of them. This didn't have to happen.
That's right. This is not a perfect storm.
Right.
This is not,
no
one
Robert
saw it.
Rubin tried to describe it as a perfect storm.
This was calculated and created.
Yeah, it was calculated and created. It's a scam. If the mafia had done it, they'd all be hung from a tree somewhere. What they did is they legalized crime, basically, and it required a bipartisan coalition. And what happened is, and Reagan couldn't pull it off. It'd be nice to blame Reagan for everything, or George W. Bush. It doesn't really work here. Reagan couldn't pull it off because he had the savings and loan scandal. And because of the savings and loan scandal, even people like John McCain, who had been involved with it, were now alert, so we better have some regulation. And at the end of his tenure, and I describe it in the book, Reagan actually had to increase regulation rather than boil it down. And that's something Paul Krugman and other commentators have really missed. I don't know how they've missed it. But it's just not true that this is, the song was sung by Reagan.
That's right. When they go back and say we owe this to the Reagan Revolution, they mean, I think where they're correct is the view, the worldview, the attitude, but the accomplishment was Clinton's.
Exactly. The Reagan couldn't pull it off, and what Reagan did was, under Reagan, you had Phil Gramm and Wendy Graham and these people. Phil Gramm goes on to be the top Republican in the Senate dealing with banking. Wendy Graham was the head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and then goes to work for
which at that time sounded probably very obscure. Commodity futures.
But she was pushing for total deregulation.
Right.
So the song definitely comes from the Reagan Revolution. Get government off the backs of business, which really meant get government off the backs of Wall Street and end the New Deal restrictions, the New Deal regulations. And I don't like the word regulation even because sometimes when I'm talking to libertarians and others, where I get a better hearing, by the way, than I do in the mainstream media, I say this is really not. I have no love of regulation. I don't like the police intruding on people's lives and so forth. And I'm not even a big believer in the federal government anymore because mostly what it does is make war, and fatten the fat cats, and doesn't really even have a poverty program anymore, thanks to Clinton's welfare reform, which ended the federal poverty program. So I'm not for a big fat, federal government, and I'm with them on that. But what is involved here is not regulation; it's fraud prevention. That's what's involved. What is it on that piece of paper that you're saying? It's like you go to the restaurant next door. You like it when there's an A on the window. Somebody has actually set some standard of how hot the water has to be when you wash the dishes. So what Roosevelt, who was no radical, had pushed through in response to the Great Depression was some very sensible rules of the road. Speed limits, if you like, warnings to other drivers in this market. And that's what they wanted to reverse. They wanted to reverse it from the day Roosevelt got them passed during the New Deal, and he did it to prevent another Great Depression, too big to fail, and all of transparency and regulation and so forth. And what happened was Reagan couldn't pull it off, even though he sang the song. Clinton came in, and Clinton, when Clinton was in and he was being attacked by the vast right-wing conspiracy, I defended him, and some of the articles I'm most ashamed of. I said nice things about Clinton. He has turned out to be an absolute disaster of a president, absolute disaster, charm aside, And what he did is he turned to the few Democrats that hotshots on Wall Street, Robert Rubin particularly, and said, asked them, he said, why don't you guys love us? You eat at the same restaurants. Your kids go to the same private schools in Manhattan. We all go to the symphony together.
We share social values.
Right, and you're pro-choice, So this is not like Arkansas where I had to deal with real right-wingers, What's with you guys? And Rubin was the broker. Rubin said, Rubin was then a hotshot at Goldman Sachs, and Rubin said, look, it's these onerous New Deal regulations that are preventing us from being competitive internationally. That was the line, onerous regulations from the New Deal. Glass-Steagall particularly, preventing.
And let me see if I can set the context. Am I correct that if we're going back to that point, that's when we're afraid of Japan? We're thinking that we're America needs to do something to stay in front.
The key word was modernize.
Innovate, modernize.
Yeah, but the modernize is very important because that shows up in the two most onerous pieces of legislation that Clinton passed, the Financial Services Modernization Act and the Commodity Futures Modernization Act.
Now, was the telecom also a modernization act?
Telecommunications. I think it was telecommunications. Was it modernization? I don't know. I have to look it up.
Yeah.
But anyway, what happened was that Rubin brought Greenspan over, and others, and the deal was made. The Fed would supply cheap money. We won't do to you what was done to Carter, but you have to push on this direction. And Clinton reached out to Phil Gramm, who was become a senator after being a member of the House and being very close to the Reagan Revolution. He had started as a Democrat and changed, and one of his students, Wendy Graham, had been reappointed by Bush to be head of the Commodity Futures Commission. Then she went off to Enron.
Yeah.
But anyway, the deal was made, and it was to get rid of this New Deal restraints, Glass-Steagall in particular. And so, and you're right, first they did the Telecommunications Act, which brought the media in line. They all loved that, and that's why the LA Times is in bankruptcy, because, they could merge markets, and there was no restraint on their greed. Newspaper still makes money, but they can't pay off the debt of all the hustlers.
Yeah, that Zell deal was,
So anyway, but basically, it resulted in these two pieces of legislation, the Financial Services Modernization Act, which ended the wall, destroyed the wall between investment banks that are supposed to be playing with rich people's money. So if you lose it, fine, it's a victimless crime. It doesn't have to be overly regulated. And commercial banks that were dealing with deposits and ordinary mortgages, and that has to be observed because that's going to be federally insured, and we have to be careful about that, and they should be conservative enterprises.
And the other difference being one was backstopped by the government, and one was not.
Yeah, one is insured, and you're going to protect it because you're not going to have a run on banks and so forth. Well, so they destroyed that wall and opened the way for Citigroup and others. And Rubin, it's amazing to me. If you guys here bought me a beer, which you've never done in all the time I've come here, if you bought me a meal next door, I would feel the need to report it somewhere. I would have to full disclosure. I said something nice about KPFK, and they had bought me a beer. We have a conflict of interest, right? Not that you ever have bought me anything. But here was Rubin who pushed through the legislation that allows Citigroup to happen. By the way, the New York Times leading the cheers in both, as I report in the book, both editorially and their news reporting. Modernization is wonderful. Rubin then goes to work for Citigroup, which would have been illegal. It was a merger.
That's right. Citigroup, what people see now, was an insurance company and a bank.
Well, not just insurance and investment.
Right.
Under Sandy Weil, Travelers Insurance had bought up a lot of these investment houses and so forth in business, and that merged with traditional Citibank to form Citigroup, the too big to fail company.
And if I'm correct, Citigroup, when it was formed, wasn't yet legal.
No.
Needed a waiver,
right.
and first a waiver, and then the reversal.
Got a waiver from the Fed under Greenspan, and then the law had to be changed. And that's when Rubin went to town pushing for the law to be changed and worked with Graham, and Clinton signed off on it. I could read from the book. It's page 52 and 54. Everybody can buy the book. It's very cheap, paperback. But it's all in there. The New York Times editorial was absolutely shameful. The New York Times news reporting was shameful. So was the Wall Street Journal. So was I was covering this for the LA Times back in those days. And the press, the media, the mainstream media was just awful. There were a few exceptions. Ironically, William Safire, a conservative columnist for the New York Times, really was against it. He saw the too big to fail problem. He saw the privacy issue. There were a few others, but they were far and few between. And then a year later, so Rubin goes and works for Citigroup for $15 million a year for 9-10 years. Okay, now come on, you can't make this up, right?
A company that wouldn't even exist if you hadn't gotten the rules changed.
Some people listening and say, "Oh, that's KPFK." I heard some guy on KPFK, and he came up with this fanciful, crazy thing. There's some guy named Rubin, and he was a big shot at Goldman Sachs, and then he went to work for Clinton as Treasury Secretary. Then he passes a law that allows Citibank and Travelers to merge, and then they become Citigroup, and then he gets a job being one of the top people at Citigroup for $15 million a year, and then Citigroup gets into all of these subprime and all-day mortgages and all this collateralized debt, and we have to bail them out and backstop $300 billion of their bad assets, and we still own 16% of the company. And you know what? A protege of this guy, Rubin, a guy named Peter Orszag, who had been in the Treasury Department, had pushed this, then is appointed head of OMB by Barack Obama, the great candidate of change, and now he is in negotiation to go work for Citigroup in a top position. Now, I heard this guy say this on KPFK. Obviously nuts, right?
Yeah,
Obviously.
yeah.
Okay, that's why you write books. If somebody wants to take the time, plunk down the $15, read it online, or read my columns in Truthdig or something, they'll see. Unfortunately, it happens to be true. It'd be better for the country if it weren't true, but unfortunately it happens to be true. Not content with that, now Lawrence Summers, the protege of Rubin.
That's right. That's the first protege I thought you were going to say.
Yeah. Now Lawrence Summers takes over, and Lawrence Summers pushes through the Commodity Futures Modernization Act a year later, and which Clinton signs off in the last weeks of his administration when he's a lame duck. He didn't have to do it. Well, he did it because Hillary was going to be a New York politician and wanted Wall Street to be happy with him and contribute to his charities and blah, 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 and he drank the Kool-Aid. And what does that say? Titles 3 and 4 of the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. It's in my book, titles 3 and 4, in clear language. It's unusual, this clear language. This is so clear because they wanted to give legal certainty to these collateralized debt obligations, these newfangled things. They said no existing law or regulatory agency will have power over these financial devices. So there
amazing.
It is, a license to steal.
So that both means no federal agency, and it preempts the rights of states as well,
yes.
correct?
Oh, well, that's already done because they had already taken the power away from the states of any bank that has any federal business or any national business. That states law. We had 23 states that had laws against usury, including California in the Constitution. We had a healthy popular suspicion of banks in this country, and that all got wiped out. Consumer protection enforced by the states all got wiped out with this so-called federal chartering, a federal perspective. And that's why they can't even set interest rate limits or anything on a state-wide level. It's just horrible. If the states had power, and that's why you have every single state attorney general is now part of the lawsuit. Every single one, whether they're Republican or Democrat, they know this is a scandal. But anyway,
which lawsuit?
This is the attorney generals have combined in a lawsuit to get power back for the states and to have
against
control.
this preemption of their financial rules.
Yeah, and they're backing Elizabeth Warren, who's the only good thing that happened out of this whole thing from bombs. But here's Summers, who pushed through that thing. He testified again. It's in my book over and over, destroying Brooksley Born, the great hero of this whole thing, who had taken over from Wendy Graham, who warned about all this. Brooksley Born was a Washington lawyer who had dealt with all this stuff. She said this is a disaster in the making. They destroyed her.
Now, for people who that name, as they're listening, sounds vaguely familiar, let's focus in on the chapter just a little bit. She was.
Well, let me preface it by saying this: the great thing about this country, it's true of other countries as well, but what I always love about this country is that people pop up. They somehow pop up and they are heroic. And she's one of them. She's somebody, her parents were school teachers in San Francisco, and she went to Stanford on kind of a scholarship, and she, was the first woman editor of the Stanford Law Review, and then was involved in the Bar Association with Hillary Clinton and on women's rights issues. She's a very principled woman, lawyer who cares about women's rights and family rights and so forth, and then went to work for a big Washington law firm, Brooksley Born, and was handling banks and handling collateralized debt. And she understood this stuff that these other guys never did understand. And she was going to be Attorney General, or she was one of the candidates when Janet Reno got the job. So as a consolation prize, they offered this very smart woman, and a distinguished law background, big law firm, big in the Bar Association, the head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the same job that Wendy Graham had. And
yes.
Brooksley Born, doing due diligence and so forth, looks into it and says, my God, we have this is way before Warren Buffett called them financial instruments of mass destruction. My goodness, we have a real big problem with these things. These things are spiraling out of control. We have to do something about it. The old boy network of Rubin, Summers, Greenspan, and old Bill Clinton combined to destroy her, even though she was on the president's working committee. And they passed this thing called the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which Clinton signed off on, as I say, when he was a lame duck president, to prevent Brooksley Born from looking at, or anybody else from looking into it, to give what Summers called legal certainty to these gimmicks. These gimmicks are the packages of these mortgages and everything else that are now causing all this grief for the world, in which the Fed owns trillions.
And for those of you, we're right at halfway mark, but I just want to say one thing before I go into that. For those who have seen this happen to, have glanced at this and don't get all the detail. What you have is, if the default swaps and the collateralized debt obligations were actually insurance against loss, you'd have to have they'd have to be regulated as insurance. If they were gambling, they'd have to be regulated as gambling. They are a little bit gambling, a little bit insurance, and they're not regulated as either.
No, they're not regulated like pork bellies are. I mean, we have commodity exchanges, and there's a perfectly normal way of trading in commodities. So if you wanted to have a financial commodity, you should trade it in the market, and it should be regulated. There should be transparency. There are government agencies that look into
like pork
these
or
things.
corn or oil.
Yeah, and there are government agencies that say there are rules for the road. Your language has to be clear. If you're going to call something insured, where's the insurance? Where's the backing? None of this happened because it was all exempted. The devil is in the detail, and I'm really ticked off because in my book I knew I wouldn't get a New York Times review because I criticized them. But how can they have such arrogance that they don't have to deal with this argument, whether it's advanced by me or anyone else? What were they thinking? The New York Times, which celebrated all of this stuff, and so the reason I'm here on a Sunday pushing, or whatever day you're going to broadcast, pushing my book, I just want to convey, it's like whistling out in the woods. And the reason you write a book is, okay, you heard this voice on the radio, please check out the book, just if you have to stand at a bookstore and read it or go online or something. But I just want to read something. The first thing that was done, the reversal of Glass-Steagall, and which when they pushed it, this is what the New York Times said. This is when they got that waiver. They hadn't even passed the law, so it's clearly this is illegal, right?
The Travelers and Citigroup,
Citicorp and Travelers were going to form together to form Citigroup, okay?
Which at that point was in violation of the separation law of Glass-Steagall,
because you're merging investment banking and commercial banking,
right.
Okay? And this is what the New York Times editorial said on April 8th, 1998. The New York Times editorial. Quote, and talking about Citicorp, Stanford Weil of Travelers and John Reed. They, quote, they have announced a $70 billion merger, the biggest in history. That would create the largest financial services company in the world worth more than $140 billion. Okay? The largest. This is a company, by the way, still in the toilet that we own.
Today,
today.
Exactly.
If regulators approve the merger, Citigroup, as the company will be called, will serve about 100 million customers in 100 countries. In one stroke, this is the editorial, they will have temporarily demolished the increasingly unnecessary walls built during the Depression to separate commercial banks from investment banks and insurance companies. That's the New York Times editorial.
That's not a lobbyist for Citigroup.
No, they're reading from a lobbyist handout. Now, look this is the news report in the New York Times.
Okay, so that was the editorial.
Well, people want to know why you need alternative media like Truthdig or Pacific or anything else, let me tell you. And by the way, NPR and others were all singing this song. This was not challenged.
This was the center, yes.
Yes, this was the center. So and this is what they said in their news report that day, front page news report. New York Times, quote, in a single day, with a single bold, a lobbyist couldn't have written this in more
flowery.
That's
what I'm saying.
Okay, in a single day, with a single bold merger, pending legislation in Congress to sweep away Depression-era restrictions on the financial services industry has been given a sudden and unexpected new chance of passage. Just a week ago, the measure, the 11th attempt in 2 decades, to update, nice word,
update.
Not gut, destroy, to update the nation's banking laws, was written off as dead. But the announcement on Monday of a giant merger of Citicorp and Travelers Group not only altered the financial landscape of banking, it also changed the political landscape in Washington. And then the news story, this is not even an editorial,
right, this is news.
The news story then goes on to say, indeed, within 24 hours of the deal's announcement, lobbyists for insurers, banks, and Wall Street firms were huddling with Congressional Banking Committee staff members to fine-tune a measure that would update, again that word, update the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act separating commercial banking from Wall Street and insurance to make it more politically acceptable to more members of Congress. This is unbelievable. Wow. Then the second piece of legislation, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which Summers pushed through.
Right.
And that was aimed at Brooks Lee-Born, who was
right.
sounding the alarm. And so this is what Summers said at the time. He said, he's testifying in Congress. He said, Mr. Chairman, the American over-the-counter derivatives market, That's the dealing in all this financial, unregulated financial
Right.
gimmicks. That's why it's over the counter. Is second to none. In a few short years, it has assumed a major role in our own economy and become a magnet for derivative business from around the world. The dramatic development of this market, this, derivative business in Athens, right? The Greek economy, the Spanish, Ireland. The dramatic development of this market has occurred on the basis of complex and fragile legal and legislative understandings. Understandings which the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, that's Brooksley Born, released, because she had put out a concept release worrying about this, put into question. She had issued a concept release.
That question.
Yeah, so we had.
This
she couldn't
market.
issue any law. She said, "We have a problem, Houston. We have a problem. These things are spiraling out of control. Nobody knows what's in them. They're not really insured. They're not really clear. These tranches don't make sense. The mathematical models are bogus. Everything we now know to be true.
Right.
Okay, and she had said that. So here's Summers, who's testifying against her, and then Summers says why he's not worried about these collateralized debt, which the Treasury now owns over $1 trillion worth because they took them off the books of the bank. The banks are still drowning with this stuff. That's why the housing market is in the toilet. So here's Summers, this genius. He's always called brilliant.
He is. He's always called.
And by the way, rewarded for this performance by being made head of Harvard at the time. So here's Summers. First, the party...
And then rewarded for failing at Harvard.
Oh, by
the way...
I'm going to get to that in a second.
Wait, for just people who don't know that chapter, not only did he take down $5 million a year in consulting fees while being president of Harvard, but he... Basically, Harvard lost more in its endowment than any other university, and they have a building project across the river there, which was Larry Summers' ego writ large, that is now stopped dead in its tracks. The people of Alston have been kicked out. One building's been built, and the rest is just sitting there because of this brilliant Larry Summers.
Yeah, in addition to his disparaging the ability of women to learn
That's
math and science. But anyway, Summers, this is what he said. First, this is a specific attack on Brooksley Born, who did understand these things. Here's Summers later saying women don't understand these complex things. Here's Summers. First, the parties to these kind of contracts are largely sophisticated financial institutions that would appear to be eminently capable of protecting themselves from fraud and counterparty insolvencies. Think of Lehman Brothers. Think of all of them.
Well, he's thinking of the California pension fund. That's what he's thinking.
From fraud and counterparty insolvencies, and most of which are already subject to basic safety and soundness regulation under existing banking and security laws, which is what they swept aside, any existing laws. Then he says, second, given the nature of the underlying assets involved, namely supplies of financial exchange and other financial instruments, there would seem to be little scope for market manipulation of the kind seen in traditional agriculture. It's absurd. And let me go and read you one last thing, and I won't read any more from the book. The opening page of my Great American Stick-Up book. Because anytime you hear somebody, I'm criticized quite often. Why does he keep banging on the banks and on Wall Street? We're all in on it. It was a perfect storm, blah, blah, blah. It's poor people who wanted to buy houses they couldn't afford. People in Riverside, California swindled and everything. No, okay. George Bush is in the White House. This I got from Henry Paul, another Goldman Sachs former chair.
Of course.
Who became Treasury Secretary. And George Bush is sitting there in the office, and he's talking to Henry Paulson. And George Bush leans back and says, "Yes, how did this happen?" This is, the world is collapsing. How did this happen? He asks as Treasury Secretary. Paulson, quote, says, and I got this from Paulson's book, "It was a humbling question for someone from the financial sector to be asked. After all, we were the ones responsible." That's Henry Paulson. We were. Then when you read in his memoir, you understand, or at least he claims, that while he was talking to the president, he himself did not know that these derivatives were based on these suspect mortgages. He did not know, according to his memoir.
Right. Now, by the way,
either he's
what
dissembling and lying or
is there's two meanings to responsible, or two connotations. One is, we were the responsible folks who were looking over it. The other is, we did it.
Oh, no. He says in the book, we did it.
Yeah.
We did it. It happened on our watch. No, because they made these packages.
Yeah.
Okay, now, Lawrence Summers, who we just mentioned, so he goes from this dismal performance, he goes to Harvard where he, brings disgrace to this institution. And then, mind you, this is not a guy who, solve the problems of cancer or something, right? I mean, he's supposed to know about...
He leaves a trail
but he's supposed to know about
mistakes.
Yeah, he's supposed to know about the economy, so he messes up the economy. And while they were in, by the way, the great Clinton years, you had long-term capital management collapse, you had all of these warning signs that this was happening in real time, and instead of doing something about it, they made it worse. Okay, here's Summers, and you just mentioned he got $5 million in consulting. He actually got, the last year when he was advising Obama, He was now advising Obama as a candidate. He got $8 million in consulting and speaking fees. He got over $4 million from D. Scheer, a hedge fund, and you'll notice there's nothing really controlling hedge funds in any of these new regulations. And he got $4 million for speaking fees. He got $135,000 from Goldman Sachs for one half-hour talk. Okay, he got it from Citigroup. He got $4 million in speaking fees while he's advising Obama.
This is during the transition or during the campaign?
No,
or
during
both?
the campaign and during the transition.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Obama knew that, and he never didn't pause. And then what Obama did when he came in, and I mean, I'm appalled by it. I supported the guy. I gave money to his campaign. I mean, I'm just really shocked, by the whole thing. And this is going to get to my other big idea, since you began the show with a very big idea. What happened to the whole world and the left and everything. Obama, just betrayed us. He went to these very same people that had caused all this mischief and horror, from the Clinton administration, and put him in charge. And he didn't listen to people like Stiglitz and Volcker and others who actually had a better take on it. And what they did is, you can argue about the bailout and whether you should have one or so, but you can't argue about we should have gotten something in return.
That's right.
And we got nothing.
That's right.
We got nothing in return. We didn't get
and by the way, what you're speaking to right now is the Fed's revelations this past week based on Bernie Sanders.
Yes. Not just Bernie Sanders, by the way. And one of the oddest coalitions in American history was Bernie Sanders and Ron Paul. He was a Democratic Socialist and Libertarian.
Right. Well, see, you'll notice neither one of them from either of the major parties, really.
Yeah. And they got to force the Fed for the first time to open the doors and windows and see something, and we see
they couldn't get a full audit, but they got an audit of what they've done since the meltdown.
Well, a lot of it. And one thing, just one little item that was in there, $74 billion made available to UBS, the Swiss bank, and where Phil Graham went to work after he gets the legislation passed. So he gets the legislation passed that allows this meltdown, and one of the big beneficiaries is not even an American bank, a Swiss bank, and Phil Graham is working there for an enormous amount of money, and they get bailed out by the Fed.
And how much did you say? 74 billion?
Yeah, billion.
Billion.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of money went to foreign banks. UBS, by the way, is the one that we're talking to, trying to get the identities of the folks with the secret
the
accounts.
Cayman Islands and everything, yeah. And so let me just give you my other big idea of what has happened. Let me just say, the big idea, because we talked about the good old days and not so good, what have you. We had a blue-blooded, first of all, agrarian democracy of the kind that Jefferson and Madison and Washington and all these people were talking about. Really, that's gone.
Right.
That went, in 2 centuries ago. But the century in the 1800s, with the rise of big corporations and the robber barons and all that stuff that came after, and so you had but you had at least a blue-blooded ruling class by birth and status and so forth, the Rockefellers and the rest. I remember interviewing Nelson Rockefeller and David Rockefeller in the old days, and these guys at least had a sense of being judged by their future generations. What would their grandnephews and nieces think?
They had a somewhat long-term perspective.
They were raised with a long-term. And so were the Chandlers, by the way, who I worked for. Was Chandler the other time. They was raised with an idea that somehow you will be held accountable after your death by your, descendants and by others, and it really matters. And they kept. That's why Carnegie and these people.
The libraries, the foundations.
A record will be kept. Now they could doctor the record and so forth, but and the results were going to matter, and facts were going to matter, and you had to leave something. It wasn't enough that you grabbed your piece of the action. But they were, thin-blooded. They weren't enough of them around who were smart, and they had to open up their schools. They had to open up Harvard. When I went to City College in New York in the 50s, most immigrants, Jewish kids, didn't even think of going to the Ivy Leagues. We went to what we call the Poor People's Harvard, City College, and everything. But they got wise. They said, no, we have to have a meritocracy. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of pressure for a meritocracy. We're the leaders of the free world, and it can't just be all wealthy people and so forth. And there was a populist tradition in America to open up the schools and have public education. So they extended it to higher education and even the elite schools. But the meritocracy has brought its own problems. Because what it's done is basically selected people out from so-called normal backgrounds of different races and different classes and different regions and trained them to be interested in short-term gain and careerism and serving people of power. So what's the whole notion of the meritocracy is, can you perform on a level that the big shots at Wall Street or the people who fund Harvard or the people who have major government power will respect? Will you have the correct answers? Because these are the questions that will be. We don't do critical thinking. We don't really encourage people to stay in touch with what they've learned from their own life experience, their own communities, right? Instead, no, we want to see that you're a top performer who can go all the way to Goldman Sachs or all the way to the Senate or something, and you're going to test well. And that's what the meritocracy is.
Interesting. So what you see is that
Barack Obama, if I'll just finish it, is a perfect example of that. Here is a guy who had a pretty normal background, and I love Honolulu and I love Hawaii, and it's a great place because of the mixings of people and raised. And then what happened? And I went to the building where he was raised in a rented apartment by his mother, and I talked to a lot of people. The Longshoremen's Union, which was a big progressive union, was the most powerful in Honolulu and Hawaii in general. They have a good library, they have a good record, and this is a normal family. Mixed with regular people and has some sense of how life really
by
works.
Normal, I mean, it was a split family. The father was gone. But what you mean is it wasn't the aristocracy. It was
regular people.
It was like the person next door to him and the person next door to him.
He was a renter. He lived in a rented building, not a fancy building. But he then gets picked because he's tall and I guess smart and everything.
Goes to Punahou.
He goes to the fancy school. And then I don't know, haven't quite figured it all out, but he then went to a school that a lot of kids from Hawaii go to here, Occidental. But that wasn't elite enough. Right. So then after 2 years he switches to Columbia somehow, and then he's off after Columbia to Harvard. And if you find trajectory, Harvard Law, and you find that trajectory, it's like it's grooming to be in this elite, and the guy reeks of it now. And yes, we have, as with many people now, if you want to go to law school, if you want to be successful in politics, you better do some community service, you better do Teach for America, you better do something good, so that those jobs are now being jammed because the market sucks, and so. But in the main, you're not learning how can I serve, the old principle of the land-grant colleges, how can I serve the farmers back home better, how can I produce a better grape, that was the principle. This is how can I leave these people in my dust, basically, or how can I get their votes and betray them, and that's the way I see this.
By the way, I just want to say, you're bringing it right at the present, but Clinton is a similar model.
Absolutely.
Broken family, Hope, Arkansas, gambling. I mean, the town is gambling and tourists and so on, and he ends up Boys State, Boys Nation. This is when in the junior year in high school they're picking out the creme de la creme, and he ends up at Georgetown and then Yale Law.
Yeah,
and marries a girl from a good Republican family from Chicago.
Right. And that's fine. I mean, we all believe in, opportunity, but then to forget the people you came from. I mean, I don't know. I'm not saying it has to happen to everyone. We have the Ralph Naders. We have a lot of people who manage to keep their heads screwed on right. Chris Hedges went to Harvard Divinity School, and I mentioned him earlier as probably our best journalist. I think he is our best journalist. You can overcome this.
Yes. It's not inevitable, but it's attractive.
Keep a social conscience, but they don't reward you for that. They reward you. Like this Peter Orszag, he's rewarded. Why? Because he told the line when he was in the Treasury Department and the Hamilton Project that Robert Rubin funded, and then he gets picked again to be head of OMB. Now he's on his way to Citigroup, and I'm sure these guys will give money to the Harlem Dance Group, and they'll vote liberal, and they'll support some good candidates, and they'll talk a good game. But in the main, you're learning not how to serve the people that you came from. You're learning basically how to, in a more sophisticated way, screw them and take advantage of them.
Yeah, I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Robert Scheer, editor-in-chief of Truthdig.com and author of many books. The latest is The Great American Stick-Up. We've got about 6 minutes left, Bob. I'm going to throw two big questions at you, and you can take either one. One is that when I look at our country, at the way we did the savings and loan crisis, the way we did Enron and the dot-com bubble, the way we did Iraq, the way we did the meltdown on Wall Street, that you have the leadership of this country having a completely screwy idea of risk. They look at the best case scenario and put either our young men and women's lives or people's savings or people's pensions at risk with no what's happened, what's going on there that and it isn't like we learn from one to the next. I look at all of those and they're the same thing. No sense of proportion about what's risky and what the incentives are, and people take everybody down with them. If you want to take that one, take that one. My second question.
Well, let me take that one, and then
one.
I'll answer it in one sentence.
Yeah.
They have no sense of being held accountable. They do not think they will be judged. They do not think they'll be held accountable. They'll be out the door before the shit hits. Oh, you're not allowed to say that.
No.
Before it hits the fan, okay? They'll be out the door before we see what's happened, and that's it. And they're right. Lawrence Summers was out the door and he made his money. Robert Rubin made his money, and then went back and made more money. They think the media, their PR people.
But here I accept
care.
that.
They
I
have
accept
no
that.
social conscience. They don't.
That now you're getting to another thing. I'm saying even if you don't think you're going to get caught, why this one after another? We throw all our eggs
because
in
careerism trumps everything. Money trumps everything. It's pretty decadent culture they live in. They no longer believe in a judging God of any kind, whether it's Hebraic, Muslim, Christian. They really don't. They pay homage to it, but they don't really being there. I actually do, and I'm an atheist. But I look at the Catholic Cathedral when I'm writing my columns, and I think of Cardinal Mahoney. I think, well, am I doing God's work? What would Jesus do? I actually ask those questions. What can we learn from Scripture? These people think you're a nutcase if you even bring that up. There's no such restraint. There's no such concern about what is the right thing to do. These people are cut loose from any of those kind of moral bearings. They just are. Otherwise, they wouldn't Bernie Madoff screw the Jewish community?
I know.
Jewish
one could say, oh, he's a sociopath. What I'm saying is,
he wasn't a sociopath. He was
is that if everybody.
Well, first of all, we call him a sociopath. He was a highly respected member. He was a head of the outside committee of the SEC.
That's right.
He was a leader in his
industry.
That field,
who are we talking
about?
He was respected and a leader.
Yes. What's your second question?
My second question is, if, and I said it at the top, you've been looking at things for 45, 50 years, up close. If you were 20 years in the future, you look back, are we going to turn things around? And if so, how did it happen?
We will turn things around by being a somewhat less important and self-conscious leader of the world. I think we have to become a little more like the social democracies. I think we have to take care of our own people. You don't do NAFTA and assume.
But wait. Here's my question. How is that going to happen?
Because
how does this flip happen?
The only positive scenario is if we develop a progressive populist alternative to the Tea Party. If we break with this Obama Democratic Party fascination with that elite and we say, no, we're going to speak to the pain that people, the 50 million Americans who've lost their homes or are underwater on their mortgages, the 9.8% that are unemployed, the much higher that aren't even being counted.
Another 10 or 15%
the 44 million people that are living under the official poverty line in this country.
The 50 million who don't have insurance still.
So if there develops a progressive populist voice as opposed to the right-wing demagogic populist voice, I think we have a chance. If we don't develop a populist position, not just a voice, but a base, and it's hard going because you don't have the progressive unions anymore, really. You have a few that kind of protecting their government workers and a few others. It's rough, but that will be the only way, a sense of proportion of who we are in the world. We aren't the kings. We don't have to intervene everywhere. We shouldn't be spending all this money on the military. That was my last book.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be, managing everything around the world, and we shouldn't be engaging in trade deals and everything that screw our own workers and screw the environment. We have to be concerned about nurturing our own population, taking care of our people.
So let me ask you, you've been out speaking on this book?
Yeah.
Do you feel that there's a possibility of that happening?
I feel when I get to speak to people, I feel very optimistic. People are sensible in this country, and they know when they're being screwed. The problem is they're amused to death with gadgets.
That's
they're
right.
Blindsided. They're lied to consistently. They don't get the basic data. And the stuff, there's an army of these PR people and lawyers and hustlers and con artists to tell them that it's their fault. You lost your house because you didn't do the right thing. Blame the victim. That's what they do. And
then there's the Citizens United, the unlimited corporate cash, which means that we have democracy by 30-second spots.
And then they come along and say, the problem is gay marriages, or the problem is, women have been liberated or something. They come up with demagogues. It's immigrants. Immigrant bashing is their favorite one. And that's real. It's a toxic mix, by the way. This country could get in. You're asking for a positive. There could be very, very bad going up the road because we could follow the way of Germany. We have very high economic expectations. I mean, the old Germany.
Yes. Not the new Germany.
We have very high economic expectations in this country. We go through 10 years of rough times.
That's right, where you don't have a housing bubble to balance your credit card on.
People are going to get angry, and they're going to look for victims, and they're going to blame, scapegoat people, and it could be very ugly. That's why, I'm here talking to you. I think we need to develop a progressive, healthy alternative.
Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. By the way, you've referred 2 or 3 times to other countries are doing okay. The most popular thing I've done on Alternet over the last year was a book. Was an interview on Tom Gagan's book about Germany. I'm amazed that progressives in this country don't know that other countries have ways of handling capitalism and society that seem to be working.
Brazil is an example you mentioned earlier that's also had some
exactly.
success.
So. Bob's newest book is The Great American Stick-Up. The website is truthdig.com. You can listen to this week's conversation and many others anytime by linking to the podcast. You can do that either at iTunes or at terrencemcnally.net or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. Those are both the same site. You can also sign up to have it delivered to you weekly, either at iTunes or on the site. You can sign up at the site or by emailing me at temcnally at mac.com, temcnally@mac.com, to get a weekly announcement telling you who's going to be on and what we're going to talk about and some background on the issues. Thank you, Bob Scheer. Keep up the good work.